Good evening, my friend. If you're hearing these words, it means you found a moment for quiet. Sit back, find a warm place, and let the night unfold around you, slowly, like an old letter someone opens with care. And while we're here, beneath this same sky, let me invite you on a journey. Not a hurried one, not with a clatter of wheels, but step by step, like the men who once laid a path through mountains and deserts. If you enjoy the road we traveled tonight, subscribe, and we'll meet again the next night. Tonight is silent, but not empty. It breathes with the slow, deep rhythm of the earth, and far away, somewhere beyond the darkness, comes a long, trailing call of a train whistle. It stretches out like a ribbon of smoke, carrying with it something old. I'm sitting on the porch of my weathered home, elbows resting on my knees. Beneath my boots, the boards are darkened with age, and behind me lie years steeped in the scent of pine, pitch, rust, and the wind off the high mountain passes. I close my eyes, and this is no longer tonight. I hear another whistle, short and deep, from a steam engine breathing coal and water. I hear the ring of hammers on spikes, the steady rhythm of hundreds of hands working in unison. I feel the sting of cold mountain mornings, my fingers gripping the worn wooden handle of a pick, frost still clinging to my cheeks. Back then, my name was Samuel Gray. Now I'm just an old man who set down his hammer decades ago. But in my memory, it's all still alive. How he set out east from Sacramento, climbed into the Sierra Nevada, wrestled with stone and snow, and later, the desert. And if you don't mind, I'll tell you that road. The one we built mile by mile, the Central Pacific Railroad, from the green valleys of California to the place in Utah where a golden spike was driven into the earth. That summer, Sacramento breathed dust and timber. The streets, still unpaved, lay underfoot in long yellow-gray ribbons, kicking up clouds with every step of a horse or wagon. The air was thick with the scent of pine pitch, river water, and coal. Steamboats moved up and down the American River, bringing with them the noise of fresh news and the smell of faraway goods. At the time, I was working as a dock laborer, unloading sacks from barges, hauling crates to the warehouse. My shoulders were marked with the bruises of leather straps, my hands hardened with calluses, and my thoughts kept circling one truth. Another year of this, and I'd be stuck here forever. But then the news came, early one morning. Just as the sun began to break through the fog over the river, a large sheet of paper appeared on the wall outside the warehouse. The letters were bold and sharp. Men wanted for the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad. Pay, $30 per month. Food and lodging provided. Work is hard but steady. Report to the market square. Beneath the notice was a name, and just below that, the seal of the Central Pacific Railroad Company. By noon, half the city had heard. In the market, between stalls of vegetables and sacks of flour, small knots of men stood arguing, some shaking their heads, muttering, "Mountains, snow, blasting, we've heard the stories." Others grinned, seeing the offer a chance to leave behind odd jobs and muddy streets. I went. In the market square, a long table had been set up, and behind it sat two men in vests with hard, weathered faces. One was tall, with deep creases in his brow. The other was stocky, with short, graying beard. Off to the side stood a translator, a small Chinese man in a blue jacket, quietly speaking with a group of his countrymen. A line had already formed. One by one, the men stepped forward, giving their names, ages, and where they were from. Each was written down, signed, or marked with an X if they couldn't write. They were handed a number and given a short rundown of the terms. Work from sunup to sundown, 2 meals a day, sleeping in tents or bunkhouses, pay once a month in cash. I took my place in line. Next to me stood an Irishman with thick mustache tips curling slightly upward. He introduced himself as Patrick, said he'd laid track before Maine, but here they pay better and it doesn't rain near as much. Behind him were two Germans, brothers, nearly identical, each with neatly trimmed beard. When my turn came, the tall man looked at me as if sizing up a sack of grain. Name, Samuel Gray. Age, 27. What's your work? Docks and warehouses. Shovel, cart rope. He nodded, jotted something down, slid a pencil toward me, and tapped the place for my signature. I wrote my name, and in that moment, I felt the page in my life turn over. After signing, we were led to the company's yard at the edge of town, right beside the tracks. Under a large canvas awning lay tools, crates of steel spikes, stacks of wooden ties, and spools of heavy cable. The air was rich with the smell of oil and iron. We were issued our basic kit: a pick, a shovel, a hammer, a pair of work gloves, and a thick, rough-woven shirt. For those without boots, the company handed out heavy leather ones, the heels shod with iron cleats. While we waited for departure, Patrick told stories of his time on the Eastern lines, how they laid track through swamps, and how once a supply car had derailed and lay on its side for a week until they tore it apart for lumber. The Germans spoke quietly to each other, and the Chinese crew sat apart, warming their hands over a small fire, drinking tea from tiny clay cups. I looked at them all, different men from different corners of the world, and thought how, in just a few days, we'd be sleeping under the same roof and lifting the same rails. By late afternoon, we were told to load onto open flat cars hitched behind a freight train. The long cars were stacked with crates, barrels, and tools, with our small bundles wedged between. We found our places wherever there was space, and the train lurched forward. Sacramento fell behind. The foothills began to rise. The rivers ran faster, the trees taller and darker. The air cooled, and with it came the feeling that this wasn't just another job. We were setting out on a journey from which we would return as different men. Ahead lay the Sierra Nevada. The train climbed higher, and the color of the world changed. Behind us lay the yellow streets of Sacramento, where dust clung to boot heels and burst into clouds at every step of a horse. Now, beneath the rails dark, damp hillsides wrapped in the roots of old trees slid past. Pines and firs rose tall, their trunks thick enough to take two men to encircle, and the air was rich with the scent of resin and cool mountain shade. Our train moved slowly, as if it too were breathing the thin alpine air and learning its weight. In the narrowest passes, it would let out a long whistle, the sound leaping from slope to slope like it was being passed along hand to hand, until it dissolved somewhere far ahead in the silence. By the time we jumped down beside the temporary supply depot, the day was already leaning toward evening. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a dark, weathered face and heavy brows, lined us up. His voice was low and even. Tomorrow morning, we start preparing the grade. No rails yet. You'll make the earth ready to take them. That means leveling, filling, cutting into slopes. And remember, mistakes in the mountains cost dearly. We carried our tools into the bunkhouses, long wooden cabins with a single row of bunks and narrow aisles between. The air smelled of fresh timber, hay stuffed into mattresses, and a faint dampness. Rain came fast here, without warning. At dawn, the mountain air was sharp and clear. Stepping outside felt like breathing water. Somewhere far below, a river roared, the forest pressing behind the camp, and beyond it rose the sheer wall of the mountains. Work began with marking the route. Two foremen walked ahead with survey poles, pacing out where the future track would run. Their steps measured the earth. Their eyes searched for the flattest line. We followed, shovels, picks, and wheelbarrows with wooden wheels in hand. Where the ground was soft, we stripped away the turf and used it to fill the low spots. Where stone jutted out, we set to work with picks and iron bars, breaking it apart piece by piece. Now and then, a great boulder would block the way. Then the foreman would call for extra hands. We'd wedge in a lever, strain every muscle, and slowly pry it loose until it rolled away down the slope. The work had its rhythm, not fast, but without pause. Hammer strikes into the rock, shovel into earth, soil into the barrow, while squealing along a plank. On the second day, we worked with a drill for the first time. The rock held stubborn, and a pick was no match for it. Two men gripped the long steel drill while two others swung heavy hammers, driving it into the stone half an inch at a time. After each set of blows, the drill was turned and the strikes began again. The dull ring of iron on steel echoed up and down the gorge. When the hole was deep enough, the powder man poured in black powder, set the fuse, and carefully tamped it down with small stones. We stepped back to a safe distance. The foreman lit the fuse. A thin ribbon of smoke crept toward the rock, and my heart began to beat faster. The blast never came suddenly. It felt as though the mountain gathered strength before letting go. Then a deep, muffled roar, clouds of dust, and the sting of sulfur on the air. When the haze cleared, we went back in, tossing aside the jagged shards. The fresh split stone was sharp as a blade, and you had to watch your hands or you'd slice them open. When the sun dropped behind the tops of the pines, we returned to camp. Small fires burned along the row of bunkhouses. The cooks brought out big kettles of stewed beans, meat, and bread. Beside them sat a vat of hot tea. The Chinese crew sat together, their voices low and steady, like they were exchanging not words but whole pieces of memory. Patrick, the Irishman, could always stir a laugh, sometimes a joke, sometimes a tune he'd hum, tapping the beat with a spoon on the side of a pot. I sat and listened to it all. Somewhere in the dark, the fires cracked, smelling of smoke and the hot iron of hammers drying by the flames. Far off in the mountains, the sound of water carried, a kind of song that had been here long before we ever came. The first true winter in the mountains came as if the peaks had decided to show us their full strength. Only the day before, the sun had shown over the line of track, and we'd worked with our coats open. But that night, the wind roared to the crowns of the pines so hard it woke me, and I knew something had changed. The roof of the bunkhouse groaned under blows of air. The boards creaked faintly, and through the gaps came the sharp, almost stinging scent of snow. By morning, when we stepped outside, the world was different. Where bare earth had been yesterday, snow now lay, first to the knees, then higher still. The trees stood silent, wearing heavy white crowns, and far off, above the ridges, clouds dragged low, as though someone were spilling thick ash across the sky. To reach the work site, we now had to dig a path through the drifts. Mountain snow didn't fall as a light veil. It came in slabs, packing down under its own weight. We took shovels and cut narrow corridors through it, their walls higher than our heads. Inside those corridors, it was quiet, and only the scrape of the shovel and the weight of our breathing broke the stillness. Sometimes you'd walk that snow tunnel for hundreds of steps before reaching the place we worked. The sun rarely touched those spots. Mountain walls kept them in shadow, and the cold there felt sharper still. Snow was not just an obstacle. When it lay thick, the earth beneath didn't freeze as quickly, and you could still dig. But in the mountains, everything could change in a single day. Today we cleared a site. Tomorrow would be under a fresh layer, and we'd start all over again. The hammer and pick grew heavier in the cold. The metal stole heat from your hands, even through gloves. We wrapped the handles in rags so our fingers wouldn't stick to the frost. A hammer strike into a spike sounded muffled, as if the wood and iron themselves were bundled in winter coats. The Chinese crews taught us how to save strength in the cold. They wore several thin layers instead of a single heavy coat, so the warmth spread evenly. They drank hot tea with ginger, saying it lit the fire inside. I remember one frozen morning when Lee, the eldest among them, handed me a cup of his tea. It was sharp, a little sweet, a taste I never forgot. Lee smiled and said, Cold is like the mountains. You won't make it go away by being angry. You must go around it. One day, we were working not far from the pass when we heard a sound you could never mistake. It wasn't thunder or wind. It was a low, swelling rumble, like the mountain itself turning over in its sleep. Someone shouted, "Avalanche!" And we dropped our tools, running sideways away from the fall line. The snow-covered slope shifted, and the white mass began to move. Trees vanished into it like blades of grass underwater. When it was over, two of our men were nowhere to be seen. We searched until nightfall, digging with hands and shovels, but found only a pair of gloves and a hat. That evening, the camp was silent. No songs, only the wind moving between the bunkhouses and the crackle of logs and stoves. We insulated the bunks as best we could, stuffing burlap in the cracks, laying extra planks. Inside it smelled of wood, smoke, and damp clothes drying by the fire. The cook made thick stew of beans and meat, and that smell was perhaps the strongest reason to work all day. After supper, we sat by the fire, listening to the wind howl through the mountains, each man alone in his thoughts. Some dreamed of spring, some of the sea, and some simply stared into flames as if they might show the road home. After that winter, I understood one thing clearly. The mountains have no patience for haste. Here, every step has to be earned, and even the shortest stretch of track could take weeks to lay. Spring brought no relief. Snowmelt poured down from the high ridges, bringing rock slides and torrents of icy water. The ground beneath our boots turned slick, and sometimes it simply slid out from under us, taking our tools along for the ride. The hardest work came where the line met solid rock. There, the shovel and pick were useless. We had to bring out the drill and work it for hours. One man would hold the heavy iron. Two more would take turns swinging the sledgehammers, and a fourth would twist the drill after each strike, so it bit evenly into the stone. Every blow echoed through your hands, your shoulders, even your teeth. When the hole was ready, the blasting master would arrive with his canvas satchel, powder, fuses, and wadding. He moved slowly, like a priest repairing an altar, pouring the black powder into the hole, setting the fuse, tamping it down with bits of stone. Then we'd all step back to a safe distance. The moment before the blast was always the same, like the mountain itself had paused to hold its breath. The fuse hissed, letting out a thin thread of smoke, and in the silence you could hear it burn. Then came the deep thud, and the ground shuddered under our feet. Dust rose in a wall. Stone clattered down in a cascade, and the sharp smell of sulfur filled the air. We waited for the smoke to clear before it turned to work, clearing the rubble. Sometimes the blast didn't go exactly as planned, and chunks of rock flew farther than expected. Once, a shard struck Patrick on the shoulder, knocking him to the ground. We pulled him aside, and Zhang, the Chinese cook, brought him a steaming brew that smelled of bark and honey. Patrick grimaced, but he drank it. Within a week, he was back on the line, though swinging his hammer with his left hand. The days blurred into a single rhythm, drilling, blasting, clearing, laying ties and rails. The sun would burn one day and hide the next, and we stopped counting days. Only the miles of track behind us mattered. Evenings, we'd return to camp, light the fires, and dry our gloves and coats, heavy with dust and sweat. The air carried the mingled scent of pitch, smoke, and hot iron. The quietest moments came after supper, when someone might take up a fiddle or hum softly in the dark. Lee would sometimes sing songs in his own language. I didn't understand a word, but I could hear it in the sound of a road and a home. In those moments, the mountain seemed less harsh, and even the cold wind couldn't drive away the feeling that we weren't just working here. We were laying a path that would remain for generations. Sometimes in the mornings, before we took up our tools, I'd wander a little way from camp. There was a spot where the path veered away from the tracks, opening onto a small clearing bathed in gentle light. In the mountains, The sun arrived slowly, first brushing the tops of the pines, then spilling down their tall trunks until finally it broke onto ground in golden patches. Here in the Sierra, the trees were true giants. The sequoias stood in silence, like ancient sentinels, having watched over countless generations of people. I doubted they cared much about our railroad. I'd rest my hand on their bark, warm, rough, deeply furrowed, and feel the weight of hundreds of winters and summers held within it. Now and then, when our work was quiet, deer would appear from the shadows. They kept their distance, standing still to listen. Their dark eyes held no fear, only a careful curiosity, as if they were trying to understand what new trail was taking shape in their forest. After a moment, they would drift away, stepping softly over the moss. At night, when we sat by the fire, we sometimes heard a coyote cry far off in the mountains. His voice carried over the valleys, lonely yet calm, like he was simply reminding the world that this was still his land. But my favorite moments came after rain, when the clouds suddenly broke and the snow peaks revealed themselves. They shone with a cold light, even on the warmest days. Sometimes it seemed they belonged to another world we would never reach, but one that watched us from afar. In those moments, the work felt like more than just hard labor. We weren't only cutting a path through the mountains, we were witnesses to their life, and maybe in some way, they would remember us, just as I remember the scent of pine pitch, the cry of a coyote, and the light on the peaks after a storm. After those still mornings, when the world seemed frozen in golden light, the work always pulled us back into the dull rhythm of hammers and the foreman's shouts. That day we were sent to a stretch of track that looked nearly impassable. The rock rose straight up from the embankment, a sheer wall of dark gray, streaked with veins of yellow quartz. It was as hard as the mountain's own will, unbroken by a pick, refusing to crumble, sending every strike back in a ringing echo that left our ears humming. We began with drilling. That was always a test of endurance, not strength. 2 men held the drill, while 2 others swung the heavy hammers, taking turns so the strikes landed in steady rhythm. Each blow had to fall dead center on the steelhead, miss, and the drill could slip, smashing a hand or a knee. Every few strikes, the drill was turned, biting deeper without binding. The air here was heavy. The sun hung low, yet the mountains on both sides trapped the heat like a stone chamber. Sweat ran into the dust from the rock, turning our faces a ghostly gray-white. When the first hole was ready, the powder man, a short, quiet man named Murdoch, stepped up with his canvas bag. He always moved slowly, as if speaking to the rock itself. Powder poured in, fuse set, tamped with pebbles. Then we stepped back behind the nearest outcrop and waited. That moment before the blast was always the longest. The fuse hissed, trailing a thin thread of smoke, and in the silence, even your heartbeat sounded loud. Then came the muffled, hard thump. The rock shivered, like something had woken inside it. A cloud of dust rose and spread, drawing a gray veil over everything. We waited for it to settle, then went back in. The broken stone lay in heaps, some pieces sharp as a knife's edge. We pried them aside with bars, leveled the ground, prepared the bed for ties. But the mountain didn't yield easily. The next section was harder still, forcing us to bore several holes at once and blast them nearly together. Work stretched into the evening, when the sun slipped behind a ridge and cold came suddenly, as it always does in the mountains. The foreman chose not to stop. Kerosene lanterns were lit, their trembling light playing over the rock face. Shadows stretched long, and the blows of the hammers sounded deeper in the gloom. By the time we finished, night had fallen across the mountains. Far below, we could hear the river's constant rush. Above, a few cold stars pierced the ragged clouds. We walked back to camp in silence, each man with his hammer slung over his shoulder, carrying that strange weight in the body when fatigue can't be told apart from calm. The smell of dinner met us by the barracks, stewed beans and fresh bread. Firelight flickered across our faces, and we all knew tomorrow would be the same. And somehow, there was a kind of certainty in that, knowing the day would begin with the ring of hammers and end beneath the same stars over the mountains. After many weeks in the mountains, came the day we've been waiting for since the very first swing of the hammer. The morning began as always. A quick breakfast, a check of the tools, the foreman's rough voice barking out orders. But there was something different in the air. Even the wind, which usually carried the scent of pine resin and wet bark, felt drier and warmer. We followed a narrow trail that led down from the last mountain pass. The forest began to thin. The pines grew sparser, then vanished altogether, leaving only low shrubs and rocky soil. And then before us it opened, Nevada. I stopped, unable to take another step right away. After the tight, shadowed canyons and the towering trees, the sheer openness was staggering. The horizon stretched so far it seemed the earth and sky met in a single thin line. No high mountains ahead now, only distant blue ridges dissolving into a wavering haze. The air here was different, dry, hot, laced with dust. It settled on the skin like a fine layer and seemed to draw out every drop of moisture. The sun shone without hindrance, and even the morning shadows were short. As we descended lower, the ground turned soft and loose. Sand and fine gravel crunched underfoot, and the wind chased pale yellow tumbleweeds across the flats. Everything was silent, save for their rustle, after the roar of mountain rivers and the ring of hammers. The silence felt almost unnatural. I noticed our Chinese crewmates walking with us, faces covered with cloth. They knew what we all would soon learn, that here we'd need to guard our water the way we guarded our warmth in the mountains. Our canteens were already light, and the nearest spring might be miles away. The foreman stopped and, pointing ahead, said, "Camp will be there. Tomorrow, we start laying tracks straight through the desert." His words hung in the hot air, and I realized that our struggle was about to change completely. Not with stone and cold, but with heat, thirst, and the endless expanse that could break a man as easily as a rock slide or avalanche. We moved on, each step leaving a mark in the sand, already half blurred by the wind within minutes. The sun climbed higher, and Nevada spread before us like a vast, burning ocean, one through which we would carve our narrow, unbroken path of wood and steel. The first day in the desert began before sunrise. The night had been warmer than any in the mountains, but it was a different kind of warmth, one that seemed to drain your strength, even in sleep. The moment you opened your eyes, you felt the dry air, the faint burn in your throat, and the roughness already on your lips. We left camp just as a thin line of light began to glow in the east. Darkness retreated slowly, but it brought no cool relief. The ground still held the heat of the previous day, like a great oven. Here, the track began from nothing, just bare, flat land marked with stakes and stretched string. Unlike in the mountains, where every ravine and cliff dictated the path, here the line was meant to be straight as an arrow. The foreman kept repeating, "In the desert, there's no place for curves." But it wasn't the land, it was a human body that began to protest first. The sun climbed higher, and within an hour the work was already punishing. Sand and gravel underfoot grew, so hot you could feel it through your boots. Every step kicked up a puff of dust that settled instantly over faces, arms, and tools. Water became the greatest concern. Barrels were kept in the shade of two large canvas awnings, and men went there in small groups to avoid a crowd. We drank in small sips, as if each one might be our last. Canteens stayed close at hand, but it was rare to take a drink during work. Everyone saved it for later. Sand and wind became our new enemies. Gusts came without warning, carrying fine grains that worked their way into your ears, down your collar, even into your food. One day, as we were setting ties, the wind hit so suddenly that a tumbleweed rolled right across our fresh-laid track, knocking over several tools. Working in such weather was nearly impossible, but there was no order to stop. We covered our faces with bandanas or scraps of cloth, leaving only our eyes exposed. The dust blurred the world, and even the men nearest to you looked like shadows in a yellow fog. But not every day was like that. There were mornings when the wind died and the air stood still. In those hours, the desert seemed vast and silent, and you could begin to see a kind of severe beauty in it. Tiny silver-backed lizards darted between rocks, and far off, on the wavering line of the horizon, you could make out the dark figure of a coyote watching us. He never came close, but his presence reminded us we were not alone out here. One evening, as we headed back to camp, the sun set in a blaze of copper and crimson across the western sky. The track we'd managed to lay stretched out toward it, as if leading straight into that fire in the heavens. We sat on the ties, drinking water, and no one spoke. We just watched the day burn itself out beyond the horizon. But by morning, we were back to the same hammer blows, the rumble of rail carts, the dry crunch of sand under our boots, and the long, endless road ahead. The storm came as suddenly as nightfall in the west. That morning we'd been working in silence. The day promised to be calm. The air was still, the sky clear, and only a distant smear of dust on the horizon looked like a faint mirage. But the old guide the foreman had hired to help us navigate the desert took one look at it and frowned. He spoke quietly, yet every man heard him. "It's coming for us." We kept working, driving spikes, setting ties, but deep down, we already knew time was turning against us. The sun, which had been gentle in the morning, now burned almost white, and the shadows at our feet grew sharp. The wind came without warning, as if someone had ripped down a curtain. First a light breath, then a sudden pull, and within a minute it carried sand with it. The sand got everywhere. You could hear it in your teeth, feel it grinding under your eyelids, pressing through cloth. We threw our tools into the carts, sealed the water barrels, tightened the ropes on the tents so they wouldn't tear loose. The wind roared like a locomotive, and in its voice there was something wild, alive. The sky lost its color. The sun still hung above the horizon, but its light had turned dim and yellow, as if shining through dirty glass. Visibility dropped by the minute, meant only a few steps away were nothing more than silhouettes. The foreman shouted orders, but his words were swallowed by the wind's howl. We huddled together, faces wrapped in bandanas, and waited. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Some stood with eyes closed. Others turned their heads away so the sand wouldn't strike them head on. Dust settled on our skin until our own bodies felt foreign, waited, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it started to fade. First the wind weakened, then broke into short, uneven gusts, and finally it was gone altogether. The dust sank, and the plain revealed itself again, though it was no longer the same. New rippling patterns lay across the sand, as if the desert had taken the storm's time to redraw itself. The sun was already dipping toward the west, and we watched the fire grow beyond the mountains. At first it was soft copper light, then it deepened into a heavy crimson. The glow washed over the rails, making them look like a strip of molten steel stretching into the distance. No one spoke. We simply watched the day burn out. Even the desert seemed hushed, as if it, too, was listening to the light fade. When the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, we knew the storm had left behind more than scattered sand. It had left us with a deeper respect for this land. Out here, you couldn't force your will or hurry your work. You had to take it as it was. Life in camp changed almost without notice, yet every man felt it deep in his bones. In the mountains, nights were cold and scented with pine resin. Firewood had to be hauled from the forest, And when the day's work was done and we gathered around the fire, we'd always hear the crackle of branches and watch sparks rise into the dark sky, vanishing among the stars. We slept in heavy canvas tents on beds of pine boughs, waking each morning to the smell of damp earth and snow. Here, in the desert, the night's chill was different. It wasn't sharp like in the high country, but slow. First drinking the warmth from your body, then wrapping you in a dry cold. Firewood was a luxury. So our campfires stayed small, their smoke rising in thin threads that disappeared quickly into the dark. Sand was everywhere, worked its way into blankets, tools, even the bread we ate. In the mountains, you could wash your face in a freezing stream. Here, water came from barrels, rationed so tightly that even a bucketful for one man was a luxury. The men had changed, too. In the mountains, evening talk was about work, blasting rock, avalanche dangers. Here, conversation slowed, often drifting toward other lives. One quiet evening, when the wind had died and the camp lay still, an old Irishman named Connell told us about his boyhood. He had seen the sea only once, at the age of 10, and claimed its sound had stolen his sleep for the rest of his life. In the mountains, he said, I could always hear the snow fall. It was a quiet world. But here, in the desert, it's like the whole earth is holding its breath. And that's worse, because in the silence, you hear yourself. Beside him sat Chun, a Chinese worker who rarely spoke in our gatherings. He reached for his teapot and, speaking to the curl of steam, said, In my country there are deserts too, but there the wind lives. It sings. This one is mute. It has no interest in our voices. A young fellow from Utah, Jake, smiled and tossed a stick into the fire. Maybe we're just ants to it, digging our little road, while it wonders how long it will take to bury us. Everyone laughed, but we all knew there was truth in his words. The desert didn't threaten us like the mountains did, but it didn't welcome us either. It was indifferent. Out here, you had to get used to being alone, even in the middle of a crowd. That night, we lingered longer than usual. The sky was clear, the stars so bright it felt as though you could reach out and pluck them. Maybe that was why the stories kept flowing. Of women left behind, of fields never plowed, of fishing trips on quiet lakes where no dust ever blew. By morning, life returned to its usual rhythm. The ring of hammers, the squeak of cartwheels, the foreman's shouts. But after that night, the desert seemed a little different. Not softer, no, but we'd begun to see it as something more than just sand and heat. The day was hot and still, the dust hanging in the air like a thin, transparent veil, and the sun sat high overhead, offering no shadow. We were working a flat stretch where the rails ran toward the horizon in a thin, gleaming line. Suddenly, the foreman raised his hand. The work stopped. Off in the distance, beyond where our steel had yet to reach, a few white shapes moved slowly across the plain. At first, they looked like small plumes of dust. But as they drew closer, we saw the canvas tops of wagons and the steady gait of horses. A caravan, 6 wagons, a handful of riders, and about a dozen people walking alongside. When they came near, it was clear they were families. Sun-brown men, women in wide-brimmed hats and long dresses, a few children hiding from the heat beneath the wagon covers. They halted near our line, and both groups stood studying each other. Where are you coming from? Our carpenter, Thomas, called out. Missouri, answered a man on horseback, his wide hat shading a weathered face. Been on the trail 3 months now. He dismounted, came up to us, and shook hands with a few of the men. His name was Elias, and he told us they were bound for California, planning to settle in the San Joaquin Valley, where, as he put it, the land's as rich as the promised one. We stood in the shade of the wagons, and the talk came easy. One of our Chinese workers, Lee, cautiously asked if there was much work there. Elias smiled and said there was always work for those not afraid of the soil. Among the travelers was an old man who had lived through the gold rush of '49. He told us that back then, 20 years ago, this road must have been a river of people and wagons, but now it had all but dried up. Then, with a hint of irony, he added, "Soon enough, the railroad will take that river away for good." They shared their bread and dried meat with us, and we offered them tea brewed by Chun. The children watched curiously as we set the rails, and one boy even helped carry a wooden tie. When the caravan moved on, we stood a long while watching them fade into the distance. Their wagons vanished into far-off haze, and it felt as though we glimpsed a shadow of the past, drifting west, while we laid still eastward, pulling with us a new age. The night in the desert passed quietly, but by morning the sky had changed. It hung heavy and dark gray, as if an old, worn canvas had been stretched across the land. The air was perfectly still, and even the wind that always toyed with the sand had vanished. We knew something was coming. Work began as usual, but the hammer struck the spikes with a strange, muffled sound, as if the air itself swallowed it. Somewhere far off came a low, rolling rumble, long and deep, like the recoil of an old cannon. The first flashes of lightning split the horizon. The dust at our feet began to darken with the first drops. These weren't the light sprinkles that vanished before they touched the ground. These drops fell heavy, breaking the sand into wet grit. Within minutes, the sky dissolved into a solid wall of rain. Water poured down as if someone had overturned a barrel above the entire desert. We dropped our work and hurried to drag the tools toward camp. The rails we had leveled to perfection just yesterday were already drowning under streams of muddy water. In the low spots, real rivulets formed, running straight across the sand. Inside the tents, it was as dark as night. Rain drummed on the canvas, so hard we could barely hear each other's voices. A few of the men, stripping off their shirts, ran out into the downpour, not out of joy, but to wash away weeks of dust. The Chinese crew set out their kettles, catching the water as it poured from the edges of the tarps. In the mountains, a storm like this lasts an hour, Connell grumbled. But here, hell, it might go on till nightfall. He was right. The rain fell most of the day. By evening, the ground had turned to a heavy paste, and even the sand that usually slipped away beneath our boots now clung stubbornly, making each step a burden. When the storm finally eased, we stepped out into a world transformed. The desert glistened, reflecting the low sun, and in that shimmer there was something strange. Like, for a moment, a sea had been born in the middle of the dry land. But we knew by tomorrow it would be gone, the ground once more hard and dry. Only in the ruts between the rails would a few muddy puddles linger, a reminder that even the desert, now and then, could stage a flood of its own. The morning after the storm was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than on other days. The sand beneath our feet still held the night's moisture, and every step left a sharp, perfect print, as of the earth, after years of forgetting, had suddenly decided to remember who walked across it. The sun rose slowly, chasing away the coolness, and within an hour the camp once again carried the scent of hot dust. The foreman had us gathered before dawn. After the storm, the track looked like a wounded line. Sections buried under silt, embankments washed away in the low spots, and a few ties simply swallowed by the mud. We moved along the rails, each man with a shovel or a crowbar, and the work began without a word. The first hours were the hardest. Wet sand and clay clung to the shovel, pulling back with every lift, as if we were trying to tear up great, heavy sheets of sodden cloth. Where deep puddles had formed, we dug narrow trenches to drain the water away. Old Connell, grumbling as always, still worked faster than the younger men. He said that back in Ireland, when a road was washed out, you had to act at once, or else you'd be starting from scratch. Lee and Chun working side by side, laid down fresh ties that still smelled of pine tar, carefully seating them so the track would hold level again. Everyone knew their place. The men who'd spent the storm collecting water now used it to dampen the driest stretches, packing the sand firm. Others hauled sacks of gravel from camp to shore up the washed-out shoulders. By midday, the sun was burning so fiercely you could wring the sweat from your shirt. But no one stopped. Everyone understood that the faster we restored the rails, the less time we would lose. The foreman walked the line, his shadow falling across the steel like a reminder that the road had to push forward, no matter what. By evening, the track stretched out again, clean and straight. Maybe not as solid as before the storm, but strong enough to take the weight of a work cart. When we drove the last bike, a short whistle sounded in camp, the signal that the day's work was done. That night, the campfires burned brighter than usual, not for warmth, but because each of us felt we had beaten back another of the desert's whims. And though we knew there would be many more such battles ahead, this victory had its own quiet flavor, the taste of a road that was still alive. On the third day after the storm, the sun rose over the horizon like a molten copper disk, and even at dawn the air was warmer than it usually was by midday. We moved east, leaving behind a repaired section of track, the rails now cutting across a plain so bare that even the few scattered shrubs looked burned down to their roots. The water barrel sat in the shade of the supply wagon, wrapped in damp burlap, to keep them cool for as long as possible. Everyone knew the water would go faster today than on any other. The straight line of steel shimmered under the heat, a wavering haze rising from its surface. The sand here was different, lighter in color, finer in grain, and it poured into our boots, finding its way through the smallest seams. Each step landed with a dry crunch, as if we were walking over the ashes of something long dead. When we stopped, no one sat. The sand scorched straight through. Our work slowed. The hammer struck the spikes with dull thuds, but the sound dissolved quickly into the heavy air. I watched Lee bend lower than usual, just to hide his face from the sun. Connell took off his hat only for a second to wipe his brow before pulling it back down. The top of his head felt as if it were under a lid of hot iron. By midday, the foreman had us check the barrels. The first was nearly dry, the second half full, the third already close to empty. We drank in careful swallows, no more than a tin cup each, and still the throat ached for more. Some wrapped wet cloth around their faces to keep from breathing in the furnace of dust. The wind, which sometimes came to save you in places like this, stayed silent. The desert lay still, watching us with its endless horizon. Near evening, we reached a shallow basin where the ground was firmer, and the foreman called a halt. Here we set the tents, planning to wait for morning and the next wagon load of water. The camp was quiet. No jokes, no arguments, only the slow sound of someone sipping water, as if afraid the noise alone might drain the barrel. That night the sun seemed in no hurry to set. It lingered just above the horizon, as if deciding whether to sleep at all. And when it finally slipped away, the air stayed hot for hours. We lay in the dark, staring at the stars, each man thinking the same thing. Tomorrow will be the same road, the same sand, and the same thirst. The morning began slowly, with almost no sound. In camp, everyone was saving their strength, waiting for the wagon with water. The foreman had sent 2 riders out the night before toward the nearest supply depot, and now all eyes drifted to that thin line on the horizon where the sand met the sky. The sun rose, and the heat shimmer returned, wavering above the ground. Every hour without water felt longer than the entire week before. We worked slowly, only enough to keep from standing still. The hammer struck the spike, but more for the sake of rhythm than speed. Then one of the men shouted, pointing into the distance. At first I thought he was seeing a mirage, but no, coming from the southwest, raising a small cloud of dust, was a wagon drawn by 2 mules. The sun flashed on the steel hoops of the barrels, and that glint sparked the same feeling in us as the first snowfall of childhood. Simple, wordless joy. When the wagon finally rolled into camp, everyone gathered around. One of the riders swung down from his saddle, wiped the sweat from his face, and said, "Enough to last a week." The foreman ordered a cup of fresh, cold water for each man. The first swallow burned the throat, the second brought cool relief, and the third made you feel alive again. We sat right there in the sand with our cups in hand, forgetting for a moment about rails, dust, and fatigue. Later, as the sun began to sink, the campfire was lit. Lee brewed a large pot of tea. Connell pulled out an old pocket knife and began slicing dried meat, and young Thomas, the carpenter, told how he'd traveled down the Missouri on rafts as a boy. Someone mentioned the storm a few days back. Another spoke of the wagon train we'd met a week earlier. And as I listened, it struck me that our railroad was a kind of caravan too, one made of steel and timber. We were moving toward others, leaving behind a line that would stand for years, marking the fact that people had once worked and lived here. That night, the fire burned steady, and the tea tasted sweeter than any drink in town. Even in the desert, among the sands and heat, we had, for a few hours, a small corner of comfort where a man could simply sit and watch the moon rise over the rails. We had been crossing the plain for several days when the ground ahead suddenly fell away. Only yesterday, the rails had stretched forward without a break. But this morning, as soon as we crested a low rise, the land opened up before us, a canyon, like a deep wound cut into the body of the earth. Its walls dropped sharply, sheer and unforgiving, and at the bottom lay a narrow ribbon of river, dark and still under the scorching sun. We stopped at the edge. The wind, which until now had barely touched our faces, ran freer here, carrying with it chill that felt almost like it had blown down from the mountains. The drop was no less than 100 feet, and ahead of us, no road at all. The foreman stood with his hat brim pulled low, silently studying the gap. Then he spoke quietly, but loud enough for all to hear. Either a fill or a bridge, and there's no time to think it over. A few of the men climbed partway down to check the ground. The rock was hard, but crumbled underfoot like coarse sand. The Chinese crew laid out their tools and began measuring the span, marking the stone with lines of lime. Connell shrugged off his jacket, tossed it onto the sand, and started hacking away at the sharp edge of the bank to make room for the first ties. The work here was different. Out on the flats, a man could swing a shovel without thinking. Here, every step demanded care. You'd stand right on the brink, drive a spike with a hammer, and hear the small rocks tumble away below, landing seconds later. By evening, we'd set up a temporary camp right at the canyon's edge. From here, the world looked both larger and more dangerous. The sun went down directly behind the far rim, flooding the whole canyon in molten light. For a moment, it looked as if the walls themselves were burning and the river below had turned a deep red. That night, the campfires burned brighter than usual, not for warmth, but because every man was thinking about the morning to come. We all knew tomorrow would be the hardest stretch since leaving the mountains. And here, brute strength or speed wouldn't be enough. Only patience and precision. The wind sang through the cracks in the rock that night, its voice quiet but stubborn, as the earth itself was saying, "If you mean to cross, do it right." By dawn, we were already standing at the canyon's edge, each man with his tools in hand. For many, the night had passed without sleep, partly from the cold, partly from restless thoughts, and partly from the wind, which never stopped reminding us of the drop below. The first to descend were those with the most climbing experience. They tied ropes around their waists, leaned back against the cliff face, and slowly pushed off of their boots until they disappeared from sight. From above, we watched their figures shrink until they blended into the dark stone. Down on the canyon floor, They began clearing a space for the foundations of the bridge to come. Those of us who stayed up top wasted no time. We hacked into the rock to carve out a level platform for the track that would lead onto the bridge. The stone was strong, but brittle inside. A single blow from the sledgehammer could send a crack running several feet deep. We had to work carefully, breaking only what was necessary. From below came the occasional ring of metal striking stone, and the faint shouts of men calling to one another. The Chinese crew worked mostly in silence, exchanging only brief words when needed. They lined the foundation pits with thick planks, so the cement mixture would set evenly and not run into the cracks. By midday, we made our first test lowering of a beam into the canyon. 2 pairs of strong hands guided it from each end, while 4 more men controlled the ropes to keep it from striking the rock. The wind carried up the sharp scent of fresh tar from the treated timber, spreading it along the rim of the canyon. We worked slowly, but every movement was exact. There was no room for haste here. A mistake could cost more than just a ruined beam. It could cost a life. By evening, we had secured the first 2 supports. They stood firm, as if they'd grown out of the rock itself. There were still weeks of work ahead, but this small victory gave everyone strength. When the sun sank below the horizon, the canyon filled with shadow. We lit our campfires once more at the edge, their glow spilling down the stone walls like someone painting gold into the depths. In moments like these, even the most exhausted among us understood. We were leaving behind a mark that would outlast us all. A week had passed since we set the first 2 supports. The canyon, which at first had seemed alien and hostile, had now become part of our daily view. We knew where the shade lingered the longest, where it was safest to climb down without loosening the rock. And we had even learned to read the weather by the shift in the wind that swept between its walls. The camp slowly took shape. At first, the tents had been pitched wherever a man found space, but now the foreman ordered them arranged in neat rows, so it was easier to find your way and keep order. In the center, we raised a large canvas shelter where the tools and tar-soaked timbers were kept. Nearby, in the shade of the rock face, we dug a shallow pit, lined it with stones, and set the water barrels there so they would stay cool longer. Every day began with the same ritual. Before dawn, the cook, John, would light the fire and set a pot of coffee to boil. The smell of fresh ground Arabica, shipped all the way from San Francisco, drifted through the tents, waking even those who'd spent half the night lying awake from a wind. After coffee, we'd take our tools, sledgehammers, saws, coils of rope, and make our way down into the canyon. Building the bridge was like a slow, deliberate dance in which each man had his own step and his own moment to move. Some cut the timber, others hauled it to the edge and lowered it down, where another crew set the beams in place. The Chinese crews worked in the most difficult spots, where the rock had to be drilled and an iron pin driven deep to anchor the structure. Their silence was striking. They spoke little, but worked with such precision it was as if they were one body. Now and then an eagle would pass overhead, its cry echoing deep through the canyon, a reminder that this land had been wild long before we came. Evenings in camp began to grow their own small traditions. On Fridays, Khan would take out his harmonica and play slow tunes that somehow always stirred thoughts of home. Lee would bring from his tent a small clay dragon figurine, a talisman, he said, that kept him safe while working at heights. Young Thomas, the carpenter's apprentice, kept a notebook where he sketched the bridge's progress and jotted down a few lines about each day. By the end of 2 weeks, wooden structures had begun to rise from both sides of the canyon, and for the first time we could imagine what the bridge would look like when finished. It seemed almost unreal, a narrow line that would link 2 distant cliffs, yet also a part of the greater road stretching far beyond the horizon. We didn't know how much longer the work here would take, but everyone understood this. When the last spike was driven, the bridge would stand for decades, and trains would cross it that we couldn't even yet imagine. The final days of work on the bridge felt like the end of a long journey. We knew there were still hundreds of miles of track ahead, but this canyon had become our trial, and crossing it meant claiming a small victory from the land itself. The timber lay stacked and ready along the edge. The sun burned as fiercely as it had on the first day, but no one paid it any mind anymore. Our hands had grown used to the weight of the tools, our feet to the narrow walkways and swaying scaffolds, our eyes to the dark drop beneath us. That morning, the Chinese crew worked on the western side, driving the last iron pins that will hold the main beams in place. On the eastern side, Connell and I carried the final tarso planks and drove spikes to fasten the crosspieces. Each hammer blow echoed through the canyon, a deep hollow sound, as if the rock itself were answering, accepting our work. By noon, the bridge stretched from bank to bank. Just a day before it looked like a scattered jumble of beams and supports. Now, with every piece in place, it stood as one, solid, stubborn, built to last for years to come. We were fastening the last railings when the wind suddenly stilled. It was as if the canyon, which had always sung with its wind, had paused to listen as we finished the job. Old Lee, one of the Chinese workers, lifted his head and murmured something in his own language. I didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. It was a kind of thanks, whether to us or to the bridge itself. When the foreman finally said, "That's it, we're done," we simply stood in the middle of the bridge, looking down at the river, just a thin thread from this height, and said nothing. There were no loud cheers, no clapping. Each of us had our own journey running through our minds, the path that had led us to this moment. That evening, we gathered around the fire. John made beans with salt pork, a simple meal, but that night it felt like a feast. Connell spoke a few words about how the bridge would stand longer than any of us, and that someday, many years from now, someone would cross it without ever thinking of the sweat and blood left between its beams. We sat for a long time, listening to the sound of the water in the darkness beneath the bridge. And though tomorrow we would move on, this canyon would forever be ours. Beyond the canyon, the land changed again. At first we moved through low, rolling hills where the wind chased tumbleweeds and fine dust stung our eyes. Then the terrain flattened out, smooth as a table, dotted here and there with shrubs and shallow marshy hollows. Here the rails went down quickly. The soil was soft, and a spike could be driven into a tie with just 2 blows. But that ease didn't last long. On the 4th day, we hit a stretch where the ground was as loose as flour. A shovel would sink in easily, but within a minute the hole would fill itself back in, wind carrying sand from every side. The foreman ordered wide embankments built, packing them in layers of clay and gravel. The work slowed, and tempers began to fray. To keep up the pace, we split into 3 crews. One prepared the embankment, another hauled the ties, and the third laid the rails immediately behind them. Each crew knew, if one slowed, all would stand still. By the time we made it back to camp in the evenings, our legs hummed with exhaustion. Connell said he couldn't remember the last time we worked in such perfect rhythm. The Chinese crew stayed silent, but in their movements there was a quiet certainty, a wordless promise that they would see it through. From time to time we met small groups of travelers heading west. They'd ask how soon the line would be finished and how far to the nearest town. One old man, walking with a cart and 2 mules, said, "You don't even know what you're doing. You're tying this whole world together." At night, the campfires burned bright, not only from the wind, but from the feeling we all shared. We were closing in on something great. Not many miles remained ahead, and the foreman was already talking about the final push. A day when we would go without stopping to do something that would be remembered. That night, I couldn't sleep. Somewhere in the dark, hammers rang softly. Someone still working, preparing tools. And in that rhythm, I could already hear the melody of the last miles waiting for us. The morning of that day began before dawn. The camp was strangely quiet. None of the usual murmurs, laughter, or clinking of tools. Everyone understood that today would be a test of endurance, coordination, and strength. Cook John lit two fires at once, working quickly to prepare breakfast for everyone. Large bowls of oatmeal steamed on the tables, alongside clay mugs filled with black coffee and fresh bread brought in the day before the new tools. Even those who usually ate lightly tried to fill themselves. There would be no lunch today, no stops until the work was done. The foreman walked between the rows of tents, making sure no one was missing. Then he gathered us in a circle and said, "Today we go until the sun sets. We're going to do what others said couldn't be done. 10 miles in a single day. It will be hard, but when we finish, our names will be known in every depot from California to New York." We set out while it was still dark. Lantern men walked ahead, their light cutting a narrow strip through the blackness. The first rails were already in place. We were to carry them forward, as if pulling some invisible thread eastward from our hands. Everyone knew their part. The tie crew dropped the timbers onto prepared bed. The carpenters leveled them and drove in wedges. The railmen laid the steel bars into place, and behind them came the spikers, driving iron home in a rhythm like the beat of a heart. The wind that morning was cool and dry. It carried the scent of the far desert, and somewhere a few miles away, there was a faint smell of smoke. Someone had lit a fire, perhaps hunters or travelers. We didn't stop to wonder. Time was moving, and every minute mattered. By sunrise, we had already made the first mile. Someone called, "Hold the pace," and no one looked back. Every movement was precise, as if we were a single well-oiled machine with every gear turning in perfect time. And though 9 miles still lay ahead, there was a quiet certainty burning in each of us. Today, we would see it through. The sun had climbed high, its light turning harsh, stripped of any shadow of mercy. The sand and stones beneath our boots baked until the heat rose in shimmering waves. The wind had died, and now every movement pulsed in the head. The ring of a hammer, the rasp of breath, the scrape of metal against metal. Our hands had grown tired long ago, but no one stopped. We worked as if caught in a hypnotic rhythm. Tie, level, rail, spike. Everyone knew that if even one of us broke the pace, it would take twice the effort to pull it back. The Chinese crew moved ahead, clearing the grade and readying the bed for the ties. Their precision was remarkable. Shovel after shovel, motion after motion, without a wasted word. Connell, beside me, had stopped joking as he usually did. His jaw was clenched, and he swung his hammer as if every strike carried weight for the whole world. At the 4th mile, the foreman called for a short halt, but no one sat down. We only wiped our brows, took a swallow of water, and kept going. With 6 miles still ahead, there was no room for easing up. Somewhere around the 5th mile, I noticed the land had changed. The low hills were behind us, and before us stretched a plain that reached farther than the eye could see. On the far horizon, faint in the haze, the dark shapes of mountains hovered, still days away. Now the heat struck the skull like a hammer. The rails were hot enough to burn, and we worked in gloves to keep from blistering our hands. The water in the barrels had gone warm, but even warm, it was the finest drink in the world. At the 6th mile, someone in the rear shouted, "Hold the pace. Just a little more and we make history." And in that moment, I understood we weren't just laying track anymore. We were fighting for this day, against the heat, against the fatigue, against ourselves. The sun had begun its slow descent, yet we pressed on. The shadows grew longer, and every step felt heavier. The hammers seemed to weigh more, the spikes harder to drive, but no one fell back. By the 7th mile, we worked almost in silence. There was only the ring of tools, the short calls of the foreman, and the whistle of the wind, which had risen again as if to cool our brows. The Chinese crew laid the ties in perfect rhythm. Our carpenters leveled them on the grade, and the railmen passed the steel along as if each length were a link in one endless chain. At the 8th mile, our chests burned as though we'd been swallowing hot air. Some hands had split open, the blisters worn through the blood, but no one stopped to wipe it away. Hammers kept swinging, because we all knew the end was near. By the 9th mile, our pace quickened. It was as if some force greater than ourselves had taken hold of us. Each strike, each lift of the rail, was part of a single movement carrying us forward. When the foreman shouted, "Final stretch!" Great bonfires were lit in camp ahead, their glow in the darkening air like a beacon calling us home. We drove the last spike just as the sun touched the horizon. The foreman raised his hand, and the pounding stopped. A heavy, warm silence hung in the air, filled only with the breathing of hundreds who had just done what once seemed impossible. 10 miles, he said, in a single day. Someone laughed softly. Someone dropped to the ground. Someone embraced the man beside him. And though our strength was gone, we all stood looking down the track as it stretched into the distance, like a road into the future. That night the fires burned long. We sat with our hands over flames, listening to the wind far off, brushing the fresh-laid rails as if testing their strength. And each of us knew this was a day we would remember for the rest of our lives. The days after the bridge was finished felt different. The air itself seemed changed, still dry, but not as exhausting as the mountains, and heavy with a quiet sense of expectation. We already knew what was being asked of us, a speed no one had ever seen before. But we had to prepare for that day. The camp sprawled across an open plain, where the morning wind brought a cool breath and by evening carried the scent of smoke from our fires. At sunset, the rails we laid the day before caught the red light and gleamed as if they led straight into the heart of a flame. Our routine shifted. Tools were sharpened and repaired each evening. The water supply was rationed with care. The cooks boiled twice as much porridge and baked twice as much bread as usual. Even the horses that hauled the rails and ties were given extra oats. They, too, would be working without rest. I often spent my evenings by the fire with Connell and old Patrick, who had been with us from the very beginning. Patrick told stories from a time before the railroad, when a journey west took months. He spoke of wagon trains lost in the deserts, of people walking on foot over snowbound passes, carrying on their backs whatever had survived the trip. "We're building something they could never have dreamed of," he said once, his voice carrying more sadness than pride. But every road has its price. From time to time, strangers would wander into camp, hunters, farmers, even a few families moving west with their children. They looked at the rails as if they were some kind of magic. One man from Illinois said, "When it's finished, my boy will be able to see the ocean, and he won't have to give half his life to the road to get there." At night, the wind carried muffled sounds. Somewhere far off, another crew was already grading the earth for the miles ahead of us. We knew that at that same moment. Somewhere far to the east, other men were swinging their hammers, and that one day we would meet in the middle. But between us and that meeting lay many more miles, and among them was one that people would talk about for years. The last weeks of work weren't as wild as the mountains or the desert stretches. We were moving across the plains of Utah now, where the grades went quicker and the ground yielded more easily. Only a few dozen miles lay ahead. And now it wasn't just us. Union Pacific's crew was pushing toward us from the other side. From time to time, riders would bring word of where they were and how many miles still separated us from the meeting point. They said work was moving fast on their end, too, and every day the gap was closing. News like that changed the mood in camp. People carried themselves with a certain sharp focus. We all knew we were closing in on the end of a great task, one that had begun long before I ever picked up a hammer on this line. The track now stretched almost straight as an arrow, and the weather was on our side. The spring sun warmed without burning, and winds drifting down from the mountains brought a cool edge to the air. The days were growing longer, letting us work well into the evening. And at night, far to the east, we could see flickering lights, fires that weren't ours. Out there, beyond the horizon, Union Pacific's campfires were burning. The grades and rails went down quickly now. Wagons hauled in ties and steel almost without pause, and the crews moved with the smooth precision of a well-tuned machine. Years of work had sharpened every motion. No step was wasted, and even our silences were the silences of men working. Every day ended the same. We'd douse the fires, set aside the tools, and the stillness of the plain would wrap itself around the camp. Only now and then would that stillness be broken by the faint, far-off ring of hammers. Union Pacific, working through the night to keep pace. Only a few days remained until the meeting point, and we all knew that there, in Promontory, a crowd would be waiting. The telegraph wires would carry the news to the cities. The great railroad would be declared complete, and the final spike, a golden one, would be driven home. But until that day came, we kept working as we always had, day after day, mile after mile. May 10th, 1869. Morning in Promontory dawned clear and cool. The air was sharp and transparent, the kind that lets you see for miles. Off in the distance, through a faint spring haze, we could already make out the Union Pacific crews approaching from the east. We'd been up before first light. No orders were given. Everyone simply knew this was no ordinary day. The tools were laid out clean, hammers and picks catching alight. Wagons loaded with the final rails, and ties stood ready. Only a few hundred feet of track separated us from the point where the two lines would meet. We worked in near silence. Only the dull ring of hammers, the creak of wagon wheels, and the short calls of the foreman broke the stillness. There was no rushing now. Precision mattered here. The two lines had to meet without error. By midday, we reached the final grade. Ahead, just a few dozen yards away, the Union Pacific crew had stopped. Their men stood with tools in hand, looking at us just as we looked at them. This was a moment when two worlds, the East and the West, would meet in the middle of a once wild land. When the last rails were laid and joined, the crowd that gathered on both sides let out a deep, rising cheer. There were engineers, foremen, telegraph operators, a few newspapermen, local settlers, even delegations from the cities where construction had begun. The telegraph wires that ran along the track were already connected to the key, and the nation was waiting for the word. On a small table nearby lay a special spike, smooth, made of gold, its sides engraved with inscriptions. It was placed into the hands of Central Pacific's president, Leland Stanford. The crowd pressed in around the joining point. Stanford raised a hammer and, under the eyes of hundreds, struck the golden spike. Telegraph operators sent a single word across the wires to every state. Done. From both sides came shouts and gunfire into the air. Brass bands struck up marching tunes and men embraced. For some, it was the end of backbreaking work. For others, the beginning of new horizons. But all understood that America was now bound by a single road from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That evening, as the crowd thinned, we sat around the campfires. Some smoked, some joked, others sat in silence, staring at the rails stretching into the distance. And I thought, someday, years from now, someone will ride this line in just a few days, never pausing to think how hard it was won, mile by mile, day after day. That night the fires burned longer than usual, and their glow fell across the rails that now would never end. That night, the fire burned longer than usual. Its light stretched across the rails that would now never end. If you've listened this far, know that your journey today has been as long as mine once was. We've walked it together, mile by mile, day by day. Subscribe, so we can meet again by this fire. under the same sky, and set out on another journey down old roads. And now, sleep well. May you dream of open plains where the rails hum softly, and mornings when the sun rises over the boundless west. Good night.